I actually think it's great that there's so much focus these days in Western society on trauma, on the conditions and events of our childhoods and how those events or conditions play out in our personality as an adult. The decisions we take, the position we'll put ourselves in within a hierarchy, how much aversion to risk that we have. I think this increased focusing on trauma is really, really healthy. And at the same time, for me as a therapist and who did a lot of therapy to overcome it, I have to raise a slightly dissenting voice, at least in the background. Because whilst it's good that we pay more attention as a culture to trauma and try to improve the childhoods of people, that is only one part of the story. Because, for example, in my life, coming from a background where I was left by my original parents, where there's bad stuff going on around me in my family upbringing, where I even nearly died in my first year, I started out in life leading a very dysfunctional life. I dropped out at the age of 21, was super involved in subculture, was a hippie, then a punk. I was too angry to be a hippie really, and drifted. I lived in squats for nearly a decade. I lived in London. I drifted all over the place and really existed in like what was at the time, the 80s and early 90s, like the bottom few percent of society. And at some point in my late 30s, I could see that my life was utterly dysfunctional and that I wasn't getting any of my needs well met. Needs for love, for friendship, for having a meaningful occupation or role in society. And so I eventually elected to start doing therapy and began over time to develop more self-awareness and to come to understand who I was. But what pushed me into doing this work and to go on my own personal journey to get where I am now was the trauma. It was the fact that the trauma in my life made my life so utterly dysfunctional that I couldn't really get my needs met. And eventually it got to such a point where I thought, I really have to take this on. And if I'm really honest, if I consider my life, if I had a much more normal kind of a childhood upbringing, circumstances and whatever, then I probably wouldn't be where I am now. In fact, I'd probably be married in some relationship I didn't really like and dying of numerous unspecified ailments, in some rather grim suburb of London somewhere. It was the trauma, it was the wounding, it was the pain that pushed me to look, because we do not live in a culture where self-examination is promoted or favoured in any way, shape or form. We live in a culture where for most of us, we are brought up to get a job and to keep moving that culture forward and to keep it strong. That's the primary consideration. No matter what our class, background, our income level, our skin colour, whatever, that's basically how it goes. And so if I consider myself, then, without considerable trauma in my childhood, I would never have developed much self-awareness. And I know, being a therapist, that I'm not the only one. It is actually very common for people who make deep change in therapy and who really develop a lot of self-knowledge. They come from a very traumatized background. Because again, it is that spurs them on to look. And of course, many, many millions of people are traumatized and never look and just go round in increasing circles of dysfunction. But nevertheless, in the absence of a society which promotes self-awareness and wants you to look inside, then trauma is probably the next best option, unfortunately. So when I look out at the world and social media and the mainstream news and see the kind of initiatives to change, parental techniques and childhood and society in general, I think it's good, but at the same time, if it doesn't proceed with some understanding of the need for self-awareness to create healthy individuality and truly healthy society, then it could end up creating more harm than good. Because in the absence of a social order which moves us towards deeper self-awareness, towards looking inside, towards going on our own personal journey, facing our own personal demons, in the absence of that, simply de-traumatizing the childhoods of kids may leave them completely floaty and spacey and having no self-knowledge and simply being willing to do pretty much anything to just fit in with society. And for me, this is a concern. So I think it's important not to simply go into a knee-jerk reaction that de-traumatizing is a good idea, or that having better childhoods is a good idea. Of course it's a nice idea, but if there is not something in the culture to push us to move deeper, then the lack of trauma may imprison us on the surface of awareness as a race, as a people. Thank you for taking the time to watch this video. I hope it's been useful for you in some way, and if you're interested in my work, check out my website, link below, or look for me on Amazon, Devraj Sandberg. There you'll find some of the books I've written. Thank you.